Well, thank you very much for the warm welcome. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. And thank you to the UNFCCC Secretariat, our host, the Government of Morocco, and the Standing Committee for allowing me to join you today. My name is Darius. I'm a Senior Research Associate with the Overseas Development Institute in London. I work on the Climate and Energy team, and today I have the opportunity to speak with you on the synergies between infrastructure systems and climate change adaptation and mitigation. Before starting, I should also mention that I'm here representing an initiative called the New Climate Economy, and ODI is a member of the New Climate Economy Initiative, or NCE. So today I'm going to focus on three things. First, what does the Paris Agreement say about infrastructure? What is the pathway for delivering Paris-compatible infrastructure in a new climate economy? Second, I'll talk about the new climate economy and the implications for the NCE's finding on both systems as well as drivers. And third, I'd like to talk about the financing challenge. How do we unlock capital at scale? So what does the Paris Agreement say about infrastructure? Here we look at Article 2. I'll just highlight a few key points, because this is the place where, among others, one can see the linkage to low carbon and climate resilient infrastructure. First, in 1A, we see articulation of the goal of holding global average temperatures to well below 2 and ideally 1.5 degrees C over pre-industrial levels. And second, in 1B, we see adaptation, again, a range of investments required. And in 1C, we see the mandate to make financial flows consistent with a pathway toward low emissions and climate resilient development. I think 1C is particularly important in this context. Now, just a few words about the new climate economy and then on to the main findings. The new climate economy, or NCE, is led by a global commission. It's made up of former heads of government, finance ministers, CEOs of major companies, mayors, heads of international economic institutions, etc. The leading commissioners include former Mexican President Felipe Calderón, Lord Nicholas Stern, author of the Stern Review, Paul Polman, CEO of Unilever, to give you a few names you may have heard of. It was commissioned in 2013 by 7 countries: Colombia, Ethiopia, Indonesia, Norway, Sweden, South Korea, and the UK, with the mandate to build the evidence base on the relationship between actions that can strengthen economic performance and reduce the risk of climate change. So far, 3 major reports and several dozen working papers and country case studies. The objective has been to promote the climate-smart transformation of the global economy, with countries around the world achieving high-quality and inclusive growth while reducing the risks of climate change. The NCE's reports and policy engagement overall tried to shape the global debate, catalyze action, and drive transformation. So what are the key findings? Let's start with the main point first. You've seen this and thought about it. You may have heard people talk about the false dilemma between promoting economic growth and fighting climate change. This trade-off has been presented to us based on 30 or 40-year-old theories about economic protection, economic growth versus environmental protection. When I was working in Korea with Professor Chung, the central thesis of the Green Growth Institute was that this dilemma is indeed false, and the countries can enjoy robust economic growth while protecting and preserving and strengthening their environmental conditions. There's mounting evidence to support this view. This slide shows that the investment needs for a low-carbon scenario, about $93 trillion between now, 2015, and 2030. And these are very preliminary numbers. It's approximately the same level as the base case before you make investments that would adjust to a lower carbon economy. So the point is to compare what is an estimate anyway, 89 trillion, to the 93 trillion, and notice that the difference is very small. Most of the benefits come from, the additional investment come from additional energy efficiency or low carbon technology, and the savings come from reduced capex from fossil fuels and compact cities, savings along those lines. I think what's interesting to me personally about this chart is that this chart was from 2016. A year ago, and we'll talk about this in a moment, the costs for low carbon technology, especially in energy, have already come down. So if it was almost affordable before, it's even more affordable now to shift to a lower carbon alternative, especially on energy systems. Some of the main findings from the 2014 report. 2014 NCE highlighted that it's possible to achieve economic growth and climate action together, and there are multiple benefits of action. For example, lower health costs from air pollution, less congestion, fewer road deaths, better energy, water, and food security. In many cases, these benefits outweigh the costs of action. In 2015, NCE's second report focused on the benefits of partnerships and highlighted the benefits of cooperative, multi-stakeholder partnerships to catalyze further ambition and generate economic benefits. In 2016, the NCE's report pointed out that developing countries, the global south, so to speak, will account for roughly 2/3 of global infrastructure investment over the next 15 years. And if the right choices are made, these countries have a choice, an opportunity to leapfrog polluting and inefficient models of industrial and economic development. But the 2016 report also noted that the next few years are critical because of lock-in of capital and technology and a shrinking carbon budget. So we have a historic opportunity to deliver inclusive economic growth, eliminate poverty, and reduce climate risk, but we have to start now. The way the NCE views the challenge of providing higher quality, more resilient, inclusive growth is in terms of three main systems: cities, land use, and energy, and three main drivers: resource productivity, infrastructure investment, and innovation. Let's start with cities. Some of the key NCE findings on cities. In 2015, building on the findings a year earlier that emphasized the need to make connected and compact cities the preferred form of development, NCE stressed the need for all cities to commit to developing and implementing low-carbon development strategies by 2020. I was intrigued when I heard C40 at last year's Conference of Parties mention that they believe that if we added up all the commitments and actions at the city and subnational level, we might actually exceed the level of ambition described in the then INDCs. I'd like to see that math. It might build our confidence. Now, the good news is we're already seeing some progress in smart transportation systems. This chart shows the number of transportation systems on the left and the adoption curves in a number of cities, evidence of an effective policy intervention, but also interest among citizens in these more environmentally friendly systems. In other sectors, the math shows that low-carbon transport, buildings, and waste are approximately US $17 trillion opportunity in terms of investment and resource-efficient growth to 2050. Let's touch quickly on land use. NCE estimates that land use interventions comprise between 15 and 35% of the mitigation potential to get to a 2-degree pathway by 2030, or somewhere between 4 to 10 gigatons of CO2 equivalent in terms of abatement potential, potentially more in a 1.5 degree scenario. The point is, we can't leave land use out of the picture. Now we'll look at energy. NCE 2014 asserted the need to accelerate the shift from polluting coal-fired power generation, and in 2015 highlighted the need to invest at least $1 trillion a year in clean energy, that is low-carbon power supply and non-transport energy efficiency by 2030, as well as the need to raise energy efficiency standards to the global best level. Today we know that coal and unconventional fossil fuel reserves far exceed the carbon budget. This slide shows the estimated carbon budget on the right in different scenarios of average temperature rise above pre-industrial levels as compared to total fossil fuel reserves on the left. We need to align prices to reduce the perverse signals that incentivize people, companies, to extract and burn those reserves. The good news, if there is good news, The good news is that solar and wind technology prices have plummeted in recent years. Solar's fallen by about 80% in cost per kilowatt hour over the last decade, and wind has dropped almost 40%. Best of all, the drivers of these price declines, economies of scale, better technology, supply chain improvements, and other factors, continue to drive these prices downward, to the point that each year we continue to install more solar and wind than in previous years. But the value of this investment is falling because the unit costs are lower. So it costs less each year to do the right thing. Battery prices, by the way, are also falling, which is good news for new, more resilient distributed energy systems. Now I'd like to shift to the three key systems that NC uses as a framework to look at this challenge and focus first on resource productivity. In 2014, NCE recommended that countries should phase out subsidies for fossil fuels and agricultural inputs and incentives for urban sprawl and introduce strong, predictable carbon prices as part of responsible fiscal reform. In 2015, NCE recommended that countries implement effective carbon pricing, including committing to introducing or strengthening carbon pricing by 2020 and phasing out fossil fuel subsidies. A price on carbon helps shift the burden for the damage back to those parties responsible for it and who can reduce it. Instead of dictating who should reduce emissions where and how, a carbon price gives an economic signal, and polluters can decide for themselves whether to discontinue polluting activity, reduce emissions, or continuing to pollute and paying for it. In 2016, about 40 national jurisdictions, or over 20 cities, states, and regions, including 7 out of the world's 10 largest economies, had put a price on carbon. More than 90 of the submitted INDCs include proposals for emissions trading systems, carbon taxes, and other carbon pricing initiatives. And I'll say more about this later if we have time or in the Q&A. But fossil fuel subsidies still pose a major obstacle to progress. Professor Chung and I, we were discussing this earlier. This slide compares the subsidies provided to renewable energy on the one side to the cumulative subsidies estimated provided to fossil fuels, 135 billion to over 500 billion for the fossil fuel side. And the gray side, the fossil fuel side, does not include the additional external costs associated with health and other forms of economic impairment. There was recently a report released by the High-Level Commission on Carbon Prices that concluded earlier this year that reducing fossil fuel subsidies is also part of carbon pricing. In effect, these subsidies act like a negative emissions price. As the Commission said, this is the High-Level Commission on Carbon Prices, it said, fossil fuel subsidies discourage investment in clean energy and energy efficiency, tilting the balance in favor of fossil fuels and making it difficult for renewable energy and energy-efficient equipment to compete. The question in one of the earlier sessions was, what can governments do to shift capital to the right sectors of the economy? I'll try to make this point very clearly, but I'll make it now with emphasis, and that is getting the right prices into the economy to send the right signals about the true costs of a carbon-based economy versus a lower carbon economy is one of the most important steps a government can take to level the playing field and make the right economic choices available to capital. Right now, renewable energy prices are falling, and we may see disruption, but the question of how long will this take is partly dependent on how soon we can get the prices right to create a fairer playing field for a cleaner technology future. Today, low oil prices present an opportunity for fossil fuel subsidy reform, and a number of countries, including Morocco, Germany, India, Mexico, Indonesia, have taken steps to phase out subsidies, showing that it's possible to do so under the current environment. From my point of view, this is another piece of good news. If we continue to see electric vehicles penetrate and reduce demand for traditional sources of transportation fuels, we may have a prolonged period of low oil prices, which will create a longer-term opportunity to continue to phase out these subsidies. In the business, they say lower for longer. Some price pessimists call it lower forever, and that's good news for fossil fuel subsidy reform. Much more needs to be done. In this context, I'll take the opportunity to point out an important piece of research done by my colleagues at ODI. It's got a catchy name, so you may remember it even if you don't write it down. It's called Zombie Energy, the climate benefits of ending subsidies to fossil fuel production. And the thesis is that ending subsidies for fossil fuel production is the missing piece of comprehensive climate action plans. To implement the Paris Agreement and keep climate change below 2 degrees, we need both supply-side policies like removing fossil fuel production subsidies and demand-side policies such as carbon pricing. The reason why it's called zombie energy is because these subsidies make or bring to life projects that would otherwise be economically unviable or unattractive from an investment standpoint. They're like zombies. They also skew energy markets. They act like a negative carbon tax. And worst of all, they lock in fossil fuel dependency. So you create vested interests in the economy who need those subsidies to survive, and then they begin to influence the politics and the policies that last longer than they really should. So this is a good opportunity to talk about the second system, infrastructure investment. The Global Commission recommendations in 2014 and 2015 highlighted the need to substantially reduce the capital costs of low-carbon infrastructure investment, including phasing out financing of high-carbon projects, ensuring that financing institutions have the skills and capacity to provide finance to low-carbon infrastructure, and integrate climate action and risk into strategic decision-making to ensure the new infrastructure is responsive to climate realities. The Commission also recommended that the G20 and other countries should adopt key principles to ensure the integration of climate risk and climate objectives in national infrastructure policies and plans. These principles should be used to guide investment strategies, particularly among the development banks. The Global Commission, this new climate economy's governance body, has an action agenda, which has 4 key elements: tackling price distortions, strengthening investment policy frameworks and capacity, transforming the financial system towards sustainable investments, and boosting technology, innovation, and R&D. Ensuring that infrastructure is sustainable can be seen as key to the 3 global priorities policymakers now have: boosting growth, achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, and achieving climate objectives in terms of cutting emissions and increasing the ability of countries to adapt. The next 15 years, we will develop more infrastructure than the current value of the entire current stock, and we need to make sure that it will be sustainable. This includes clean and efficient energy systems, public transport, efficient buildings, water supply, sanitation, and also natural infrastructure such as landscapes, wetlands, and watersheds. Infrastructure underpins success in many of the SDGs. Here, enhancing access to basic services, promoting environmental sustainability, and supporting inclusive growth are diagrammed against most of the 17 SDGs. And about 70% of this new infrastructure built through 2030 will be in developing and emerging economies, with nearly 3/4 of that new infrastructure in energy and transport. To make this new infrastructure low carbon and adaptive to climate change and stay within a 2-degree scenario does not cost much more than business as usual. More for energy efficiency and low carbon energy, which is nearly offset by the lower costs of primary energy and other core infrastructure. For this investment, both public and private sectors need to play key roles in terms of grants, debt mitigation, risk mitigation, equity investments, and flows from carbon markets. Here again, it's critical that the playing field be even for the right kind of investment to take place. In terms of the action agenda, the Global Commission's action agenda, this is about correcting fundamental price distortions, recognizing the full social costs, including externalities of fossil fuel subsidies, 4 million premature deaths a year, phasing out fossil fuel subsidies, creating the right price environment, including putting a price on carbon, and pricing infrastructure services appropriately as well. Creating conditions for sustainable infrastructure is also about strengthening investment policy frameworks and capacities. Public finance will finance about 2/3 of the infrastructure in developing economies. And in these countries, development finance institutions, DFIs, have a key role to play in generating financing models that can be scaled. Countries need clear sectoral development and investment plans that are aligned with climate goals, and should develop transition plans to accelerate scaling of clean energy solutions in a way that's fair and just. Finally, we need to look at the finance system itself as a tool to deliver the scale and quality of investment needed. We've seen exponential growth in green bonds, for example. Now we need widely accepted standards to continue to scale this market and reach the levels of investment needed. The Global Commission also recommends that countries, especially in the G20, should build on the work of the FSB Task Force on Climate Disclosure and move toward appropriate mandatory disclosure standards. Another part of the answer to the question, how do we move capital at scale? Capitalists will do things that make them money and will avoid things that cause them to lose money. If they're embarrassed or humiliated or caught out for failing to disclose, disclosure is a key driver. It's almost invisible, but it's very powerful. We need to drive and incentivize institutional investors to finance sustainable infrastructure. Today, they have an estimated $100 trillion in assets under management, and DFIs, via their shareholders, should double investments in financing sustainable infrastructure as soon as possible. Another NCE recommendation. Finally, innovation, the third system, and a key part of the Global Commission's agenda. The Global Commission has called for faster deployment of existing technologies. We need more public sector energy R&D, multi-party global cooperation, initiatives such as mission innovation, and governments and businesses should substantially increase investments in R&D and in deployment and develop genuine research partnerships together and across countries. The NC is recommending that governments of the major economies should at least triple their energy-related R&D by the mid-2020s with the aim of exceeding 0.1% of GDP. Donors should double investments in agriculture and agroforestry R&D as well, to the point about landscapes. In the interest of time, I'll conclude here with a signal to the websites for the New Climate Economy. You can also follow New Climate Economy on Twitter and Facebook. And I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. I hope I've kept to time. Thank you.